Life as a medieval peasant was hard, and winter only made survival harder. Yet despite limited resources, a lack of modern insulation, and often primitive shelters, peasant communities across Europe endured the bitter cold year after year. Their survival was not mere luck. It was the result of knowledge, communal cooperation, clever adaptations, and deep integration with the natural world. This document explores in comprehensive detail how medieval peasants survived the coldest nights and more. From architecture and clothing to diet, communal habits, and seasonal customs. Medieval peasants lived in homes that were often simple but functional. Most houses were built using wattle and daub woven wooden strips plastered with a mixture of mud, straw, and dung. This combination, while rudimentary, offered decent insulation from both heat and cold. The daub hardened to create a weather-resistant barrier, while the wattle provided structural integrity. In colder regions, stones were sometimes used to form more solid foundations or even full walls. Thatched roofs made of straw, reeds, or heather were common. Thatch acted as a natural insulator, trapping warm air inside while allowing smoke to escape. If maintained properly, a thatched roof could last decades, providing essential protection during harsh winters. Peasant house is typically consisted of 1 or 2 rooms. The larger room served as the living, cooking, and sleeping area. In some cases, a separate room was designated for storage or livestock. Central to the house was the hearth, a fire pit, usually built directly on the floor or on a stone base. These hearths were the main source of heat. There were no chimneys in the earlier Middle Ages. Smoke was left to drift upward and exit through holes in the roof or eaves. While this sounds unpleasant, the smoke served a purpose. It deterred pests and helped preserve the thatch from rot. Additionally, rising smoke helped warm the upper layers of the home and acted as a kind of primitive insulation. The floor of a peasant home was usually packed earth. Sometimes straw or rush were spread across the floor to provide insulation from the cold ground. These materials were changed periodically and could be mixed with herbs to mask odors and deter pests. Beds were basic but effective. A wooden frame, if available, supported a strass, stuffed mattress. Wool blankets and furs were laid on top for warmth. Most peasants did not sleep alone. Entire families shared beds or sleeping spaces, both out of necessity and to retain body heat. In especially cold winters, it was not uncommon for people to sleep in the same room as livestock. Animals such as pigs, goats, and chickens emitted body heat that could warm small spaces. This practice also reduced the risk of animal theft. Barns were often attached directly to the house, or only a thin wall separated human from animal living quarters. Sleeping in close quarters with family and animals may seem uncomfortable by today's standards, but it was a vital strategy for retaining heat through the frigid nights. Peasants made seasonal adjustments to their homes to prepare for winter. Windows, often mere holes or slits, were sealed with shutters or stuffed with straw and cloth. In more affluent homes, animal skins or parchment were stretched across window openings. During late autumn, additional thatching might be added to roofs, and walls could be repaired or reinforced using more daub. Any gaps in doors were plugged with rags or moss to reduce drafts. These modifications, while modest, significantly improved the home's ability to retain warmth. Furniture in peasant homes was minimal. Benches or chests served multiple purposes. A chest could store food or clothing and double as a seat or table. In winter, every item had to earn its place by serving practical purposes. Space was conserved to make room for indoor chores during long nights. Looms for weaving, spinning wheels, and small workbench often took up part of the interior. These activities not only kept people productive, but also generated body heat and a sense of purpose. In summary, while medieval peasant homes lacked the creature comforts of modern dwellings. They were ingeniously adapted to their environments. With resourceful use of local materials and communal living strategies, peasants transformed humble shelters into sanctuaries capable of withstanding even the harshest winter nights. One of the most important tools peasants had to fight the cold was clothing. Layering was essential. The first layer, worn close to the skin, was typically made from linen, lightweight, breathable, and somewhat absorbent. While linen provided little insulation, it served as a hygienic buffer, keeping the body drier and the outer layers cleaner. Over the linen, peasants wore wool garments. Wool was the star of winter where it was insulating, relatively water-resistant, and could be produced locally. A common outfit included a woolen tunic, a hood or cloak, wool hose, and in colder months, additional layers of woolen overskirts or surcoats. These layers could be adjusted according to the weather. On warmer days, outer layers were removed, while on the coldest nights, everything available might be worn, including spare cloaks, shawls, or even old sacks. Linen was grown from flax, which was labor, intensive but valued for its utility. It was cool in summer, warm in winter when layered, and easy to clean. Wool, on the other hand, came from sheep, a vital resource for peasants. In addition to providing meat and milk, sheep offered a renewable supply of wool, which could be spun, dyed, and woven into cloth by the household. Dyeing was typically done with natural materials like woad for blue, madder for red, and walnut husks for brown or black. Bright colors were rare for peasants, but earthy tones, grays, browns, and greens were common and practical. Feet were among the hardest parts of the body to keep warm. Peasants typically wore shoes made of leather stitched together, or turned boots often stuffed with straw or cloth to provide insulation. Woolen socks, if available, added further protection. Headwear was crucial. Heat escapes quickly from the head, so peasants wore coifs, close, fitting linen caps, woolen hoods, or chaperons, hoods with a cape and a long tail. In extreme cold, multiple head coverings might be worn at once. Hands were also vulnerable. Gloves were a luxury, but woolen mitts or wrappings of cloth were used when necessary. Some laborers simply tucked their hands into sleeves or cloaks during idle times. The cloak was the quintessential medieval outer garment. Made of thick wool and sometimes lined with fur or sheepskin, it provided essential protection from wind, rain, and snow. Cloaks could be fastened with a brooch or tied with cords, and were long enough to wrap around the body fully. Some peasants fashioned hoods that were integrated into their cloaks or tunics, creating an all-in-one protective outfit. During work, shorter cloaks or capes might be used to prevent tripping or dragging in the mud. Most peasant clothing was homemade or bartered within the community. Garments were patched, repurposed, and handed down across generations. Old tunics became sleeveless surcoats. Damaged cloaks were cut into hoods or mittens. In many cases, clothes were slept in during winter to preserve body heat. Bedtime attire wasn't separated, was often the same outfit worn during the day, sometimes augmented by extra layers or animal pelts. In short, peasant clothing was functional, layered, and ingeniously adapted to individual needs and local climates. Though not luxurious, it was effective. Surviving the coldest nights wasn't about fashion, it was about resourcefulness, simplicity, and making the most of what little one had. Peasants knew that a successful winter began with preparation during the previous months. The harvest season, particularly autumn, was critical for preserving food. Crops such as onions, garlic, beans, turnips, and apples were stored in root cellars or pits dug into the earth. These underground spaces stayed cool and moist, but never freezing idle for long-term storage. Grain was among the most vital resources. Barley, oats, and rye were stored in sacks or bins in barns or lofts, often elevated to avoid pests. Grain could be made into porridge, bread, or lestiples of the peasant diet during winter months. Meat preservation was equally important. When animals were slaughtered in late autumn, the meat was salted, smoked, or dried to last through winter. Bacon, ham, and dried fish hung from rafters or were packed into barrels with layers of salt. Fermentation was a natural preservative. Cabbage became sauerkraut. Fruits were made into vinegars or fermented beverages. These preserved foods not only lasted longer, but also offered essential nutrients during winter, especially vitamin C. The peasant winter diet focused on caloric density and warmth. Stews, porridge, and coarse bread formed the core of meals. Stews allowed peasants to use every edible part of a plant or animal and could simmer all day on the hearth, maximizing heat and flavor. Legumes like beans and peas, dried during the summer, were rehydrated and boiled into nourishing mush. Root vegetables such as parsnips, carrots, and turnips added bulk and fiber. Occasionally, dried meat or a preserved sausage might be added to flavor the pot. Bread was ubiquitous. Most peasants baked or bartered for dark, dense loaves made from rye or barley flour. These were not the fluffy white breads of nobility, but hearty rounds that filled bellies and lasted days. Bread could be eaten cold or toasted over the fire. Access to fresh water was a year-round concern, especially in winter when streams froze. Peasants often drank weak ale or diluted wine because it was safer than untreated water. These beverages were also mildly caloric and helped keep the body warm. Hot drinks played a role in warming the body from the inside. Herbal infusions made from dried mint, sage, nettle, or elderflower were consumed both for their heat and their medicinal properties. Milk, if available, was often boiled and mixed with grains or spices when resources allowed. In some regions, warm beer or mulled wine might be prepared during festivals or communal events. While rare, such indulgence is offered both warmth and morale boosts. Eating was rarely a solitary activity. Meals were often shared with extended family or neighbors, especially during the most difficult times. Sharing reduced waste and increased efficiency. A single fire could cook for multiple families. Leftovers were saved, reheated, or added to the next day's stew. Communal ovens were common in some villages, used to bake multiple loaves of bread at once. Likewise, grain milling, cider pressing, and butchering often occurred cooperatively. Winter survival depended on these shared systems. During religious feasts or celebrations, special foods might be prepared. Richer stews, meat pies, or even honey cakes. These occasions provided not just sustenance, but psychological warmth, marking the passage of the season. Despite these systems, hunger was an ever-present risk. Poor harvests, early frosts, or illness could turn a lean winter into a deadly one. Peasants often rationed food carefully, prioritizing children, the elderly, or laborers. Foraging for nuts, roots, or wild game continued into winter when possible. Food storage and winter survival were as much about social structure as they were about sustenance. Decisions about who ate, what and when were often based on unspoken codes of fairness, responsibility, and survival instinct. What peasants lacked in abundance, they made up for in adaptation and cooperation. In medieval peasant life, the community was the backbone of resilience, particularly during winter. Physical closeness was more than emotional support. It was warmth, labor, sharing, and mutual survival. Families often lived in single-room homes, sleeping together on shared bedding or straw pallets. Body heat helped retain warmth through frigid nights. Extended families and even neighbors sometimes huddled together, especially in poorly insulated homes. This wasn't seen as odd or intrusive. It was natural, necessary, and normalized by generations of practice. Even animals, especially pigs, chickens, or goats, were sometimes brought inside to share heat and ensure their survival. The colder months meant shorter days and fewer farming tasks. This created time for communal activities indoors. Peasants spun wool, repaired tools, carved wooden items, or told stories by the fire. Oral traditions thrived in these conditions, as folklore, songs, and fables were passed from generation to generation. Community gathering spaces, such as local chapels or communal halls, also played an essential role. Religious feasts, local festivals, and saints' days became opportunities for shared meals and warmth. Even simple activities like baking or threshing, when done together, became moments of solidarity. The church often acted as both a spiritual and material anchor. Monasteries might offer soup, shelter, or donated firewood to the most desperate. Local priests encouraged charity, and some wealthier parishioners participated in seasonal almsgiving. Lords, too, had a feudal responsibility, if not always voluntarily fulfilled, to provide minimal sustenance or fuel to their tenants during exceptionally harsh winters. In some regions, failure to do so could incite protest or unrest. The church calendar itself helped structure winter, giving peasants psychological milestones to mark time and lift spirits. Advent, Christmas, Epiphany, Candlemas. Each event came with its own traditions, which often included communal gatherings, symbolic food, or fire rituals. Peasant communities functioned on the principle that survival depended on cooperation. In winter, this translated into shared labor, chopping firewood, insulating homes, maintaining pathways, or helping elderly neighbors with their chores. In some villages, communal barns or workshops were maintained through group effort. Shared tools and resources minimized waste and extended the reach of what little was available. It was understood that any one family's hardship could quickly become a community crisis. Even child care was collective. Older children helped watch over younger ones while parents worked. In turn, elderly community members contributed with wisdom, storytelling, and tasks suited to their abilities. Enduring the cold wasn't just physical, it was psychological. Communal prayers, songs, and ceremonies helped maintain morale. Winter rituals often included symbolic acts meant to call back the sun or ensure health and abundance in the spring. Candles, evergreen branches, and fire-related symbols took center stage. Midwinter feast seven, if modest, offered moments of levity and spiritual fortification. Some peasants made talismans, charms, or practiced folk customs believed to protect against cold, hunger, or evil spirits. Hope was cultivated deliberately, not passively. Through community, ritual, and shared storytelling, peasants held on to the belief that winter would end and that life, however hard, would go on. With the soil frozen and crops dormant, winter dramatically reduced the typical agricultural workload. However, this did not mean a season of idleness. Instead, peasants redirected their energy to tasks better suited to the indoor or low-light conditions of the cold months. Winter offered time to rest from intensive plowing and sowing, but also brought its own set of chores vital to survival. Tasks such as repairing fences, sharpening tools, and maintaining carts were performed in barns or workshops. Indoor labor was essential. Mending clothes, weaving, spinning wool, and basket making kept hands busy and homes supplied. These crafts, often performed communally, were a crucial part of a peasant household's self-sufficiency. Even when fields were bare, animals still needed attention. Livestock, especially cattle, pigs, and chickens, were a major investment. They provided milk, eggs, meat, and labor, and ensuring their survival over winter was critical. Animals were housed in sheds, or sometimes even in the peasant's home, contributing warmth to both parties. Feeding them meant managing hay, root vegetables, and grain stores carefully. Water had to be broken through daily if troughs froze, and bedding was kept dry to prevent disease. Children and elderly often helped tend animals in winter, as the tasks were routine but critical. Manure collection and composting also occurred year-round, ensuring fertilized fields come spring. Firewood was life in winter. Peasants typically began collecting and stacking wood well before the first frost. Dead wood from forests, tree branches, and brush were collected from nearby commons or wooded land, sometimes under restriction from landowners. Wood had to be kept dry and chopped into manageable pieces. The household fire was never allowed to go out completely. It was much harder to restart than to maintain. Embers were banked in ash overnight to preserve heat, ready to be rekindled in the morning. Charcoal, while rarer among peasants, was used where available and lasted longer than raw wood. In some regions, peat or dry dung was burned as supplemental fuel. Winter was a time for introspection as well. Religious observance increased during the dark season. Prayers for protection against illness, starvation, and misfortune were intensified. The church calendar encouraged quiet contemplation through Advent and Lent, reinforcing humility and hope. Peasants used this time to plan for the coming spring, preparing seed stock, budgeting grain usage, and estimating the health of their animals and tools. Strategic thinking was not limited to nobles. Peasant survival depended on foresight. Storytelling and song were nightly companions, offering both entertainment and the continuation of oral tradition. Folktales were often moral in tone, reinforcing community values and teaching caution or perseverance. Perhaps most importantly, winter enforced a natural rhythm of labor and rest. Unlike modern schedules, medieval life followed daylight and seasons. The long winter nights were not just for sleep, but for shared connection. Social and familial bonds were strengthened during this relative pause in physical labor. Rest was not idleness, it was recovery. After months of sowing, harvesting, and working from dawn to dusk, winter offered necessary healing time. When balanced correctly, this season of limited exertion helped peasants avoid injury and burnout. Even so, survival was never guaranteed. It required diligence, watchfulness, and adaptation, but the winter rhythm, though harsh, was survivable when approached as part of the natural order of medieval life. The cold season brought with it a surge in illness. Without modern medicine, even minor infections could become life-threatening. Common winter ailments included colds, coughs, fevers, chilblains, respiratory infections, and more severe threats like pneumonia and influenza-like diseases. Crowded, smoky indoor spaces and poor ventilation meant illness is spread easily. Cold, damp conditions weakened immunity, especially for the elderly, infants, and the malnourished. Malnutrition exacerbated every illness. When food stores dwindled, the body's defense is faltered. Without physicians in most villages, peasants turned to local herbalists, midwives, and wise women, people who preserved generations of folk medical knowledge. Remedies were derived from nature: elderberry for colds, garlic as an antibiotic, thyme or honey for sore throats, and nettle for improving blood circulation. Warm broths, teas, and poultices were commonplace. Mustard plasters or onion compresses were applied to the chest to ease coughing. Honey and vinegar were used as tonics, and dried herbs like sage or chamomile brewed into warming infusions. The line between physical and spiritual health was often blurred. Some healers included prayers, charms, or ritual invocations in their treatment. Healing was as much a belief system as a biological process. Preventing illness was often a matter of staying warm. As discussed in earlier chapters, maintaining heat through fire, insulation, clothing, and body contact was essential. Peasants avoided bathing in winter, not due to uncleanliness, but fear of chill-induced sickness. sleep was deeply associated with health. A warm, uninterrupted night's rest was one of the best defenses against illness. Blankets, furs, straw bedding, and shared body heat were more than comfort, they were medicine. Many peasants believed illness could be caused by spirits, sin, or imbalance in bodily humors. Superstitions shaped how sickness was interpreted and treated. Protective charms, amulets, or herbs hung in doorways. The sign of the cross, prayers to saints, and holy water were common responses to sickness. Saint Sebastian and Saint Roch were invoked during times of plague or widespread sickness. Visiting shrines, lighting candles, or offering tokens to these saints was thought to bring healing or protection. In some regions, peasants believed in winter spirits or malevolent forces that brought disease. Rituals were practiced to ward them off, such as burning specific herbs or making symbolic offerings. Death in winter was tragically common. When illness claimed lives, the community came together to mourn and support the bereaved. Burial often took place swiftly due to frozen ground, and churchyards sometimes became crowded during bad seasons. Resilience was built through shared grief, mutual aid, and spiritual reinforcement. Life had to go on for surviving children, animals, and the land. Storytelling helped pass on memory and meaning. Religious teachings offered hope of eternal life, which softened the cruelty of loss. Despite the hardships, peasant communities adapted, coped, and healed, drawing from nature, community, and belief systems to endure the harshest months. While winter was a time of hardship, it was also a season rich with communal celebration. Festivals, religious holidays, and seasonal traditions provided not only emotional relief, but also practical reasons to gather, share food, and affirm social bonds. In the darkest, coldest months, joy became a survival strategy. Feasting broke up the monotony of winter and allowed for the consumption of perishable or preserved foods nearing the end of their shelf life. Music, games, and storytelling lifted spirits, and structured events gave the calendar a sense of forward movement. The Christmas season, stretching from December 25 through the first days of January, was a central highlight of the winter calendar. Though peasants had little material wealth, they marked the occasion with candles, carols, and modest feasting. Religious observance was key, with midnight mass and the retelling of Christ's birth. Villagers might visit neighbors, exchange simple gifts, or share drinks such as spiced ale or warmed cider. In some communities, a lord of misrule was chosen to preside over playful role reversals and games. During the 12 days of Christmas, even the poorest households made efforts to eat better, roasting a hen, baking special bread, or preparing sweetened porridge when possible. By early February, peasants observed Candlemasser religious festival, marking the presentation of Christ in the temple, but also tied to the natural lengthening of daylight. Candles were blessed by clergy and distributed for use throughout the year, symbolizing light and protection. Candlemas was psychologically vital. It signaled the end of the deepest darkness, the coming of spring, and the hope of renewal. Peasants took it as a time to reflect on survival and prepare for the agricultural rebirth ahead. Feasts revolved around available winter stores. Dried fruits, preserved meats, root vegetables, and grains formed the basis of celebratory meals. Dishes like pottage, thick stew, flatbreads, and baked goods sweetened with honey or dried apple slices were common. Communal ovens might be used to bake shared loaves. Ale was often brewed in autumn and consumed slowly over winter, with some households adding herbs or spices for festive occasions. Hot drinks mulled with cloves, cinnamon, or rosemary were both warming and celebratory. Food rituals were infused with meaning. Breaking bread together reinforced unity. Eating symbolic foods like nuts, which represented luck, or apples, which signified health, was common during solstice and midwinter rites. Winter festivals were not only Christian, but layered over earlier pagan traditions. Practice is like wassailing, singing to apple trees to ensure a good harvest, burning Yule logs, or leaving offerings at thresholds blended old and new beliefs. Superstitions ruled the season. Omens taken from dreams, animal behavior, or whether on particular saints' days influenced how people planned and hoped. The blending of fun, faith, and fear gave meaning to the darkest time of the year. Even when suffering, peasants found ways to express gratitude, seek protection, and celebrate resilience. These moments of joy and tradition were essential, not luxuries but lifelines. Medieval peasants lived deeply religious lives, and faith was a critical element of surviving winter's hardships. The church was not only a spiritual center, but a social hub where people gathered, exchanged news, and found support. Prayer and ritual provided comfort and a sense of control in an uncertain world. Regular church attendance, especially during winter festivals, helped peasants connect with a larger cosmic order, giving meaning to suffering and hope for renewal. Many religious holidays coincided with key seasonal markers and were interwoven with agricultural cycles. Beyond Christmas and Candlemas, saints' feast days, Lent and Easter framed the winter months with cycles of penitence, fasting, and celebration. Fasting during Advent or Lent was common, even if meager diets made it challenging. These spiritual disciplines were seen as ways to purify the body and soul, strengthen resilience, and prepare for the coming year. Rituals to protect the household from misfortune were widespread. Holy water sprinkled around the home, blessings from priests, and the placement of crucifixes or relics helped guard against evil spirits and illness. Peasants also practiced rituals to encourage fertility in livestock and crops. Planting blessed seeds or performing symbolic acts during key days were believed to influence the coming growing season. Though often limited, the church provided charity in winter through almsgiving, distributing food to the poor, or caring for the sick. Monasteries sometimes served as winter refuges or centers of medical knowledge. Priests often acted as counselors and intermediaries, helping maintain morale and social cohesion in times of crisis. Medieval peasant spirituality was often a syncretism of Christian doctrine and older folk traditions. Many winter customs had pagan roots, repurposed into Christian frameworks. This blending allowed peasants to maintain cultural continuity and practical wisdom while embracing the dominant religion. It reinforced community identity and offered multiple layers of meaning and protection during the coldest, darkest months. Medieval peasants faced some of the harshest winters in human history without the comforts or technologies we rely on today. Their survival was a testament to human adaptability and communal strength. They combined practical knowledge, resourcefulness, and social cooperation to endure and even find joy amid hardship. From thick homes built with earth and timber, to layered clothing made from wool and linen, to preserving food and managing fires carefully, every aspect of peasant life reflected a deep understanding of natural resources. Their practices were low-tech but highly effective, showing how simplicity can be powerful. Sharing warmth, labor, food, and faith built bonds that helped withstand cold nights and long winters. Celebrations, rituals, and shared stories reinforced identity and hope. The legacy of these traditions shows how social ties are as critical to survival as physical tools. Today, as we face our own environmental and social challenges, peasants' approach is offer valuable insights, living within means, using local materials, respecting seasonal rhythms, and valuing community cooperation. Their winter survival was not just about endurance, but about thriving through connection to nature and each other. Though peasants left few written records, their ways endure in folk culture, place names, and traditional crafts. Honoring their legacy reminds us of the strength found in ordinary people facing extraordinary challenge, is a timeless story of survival, ingenuity, and humanity. Medieval peasants often depended on their immediate environment to supplement meager winter food stores. While farming was the foundation of their sustenance, the cold months called for additional strategies, including hunting, trapping, and gathering wild resources. Large game like deer was often reserved for the nobility, but peasants targeted smaller animals such as rabbits, hares, and birds. Traps and snares were common tools, set discreetly near known animal paths. These required knowledge of animal behavior and terrain. Frozen rivers and ponds presented challenges but also opportunities. Peasants drilled holes in ice to fish for species like perch and pike. Waterfowl migrating in winter also provided occasional protein sources, though hunting them was risky in harsh weather. Some wild plants survived the winter frost. Roots like wild garlic, horseradish, and certain tubers were foraged to add flavor and nutrition. Collecting firewood, mosses, and herbs for medicine was also critical during winter months. Winter hunting and gathering were dangerous exposure. Thin ice and scarcity meant that only the skilled and cautious could succeed. Yet these practices helped supplement diets, reduce starvation risk, and maintain a connection to the natural world. Though peasants lacked modern technology, they developed practical tools and techniques to endure winter. Simple tools like flint and steel or char cloth were used to start fires quickly. Fireplaces, hearths, and chimneys were innovations that improved smoke management and heat distribution. Spinning wheels and looms allowed peasants to produce wool and linen fabric. Needles and awls made repairing clothing possible, extending garment life through harsh seasons. Salt smokehouses and cellars were tools and techniques that preserved food. Peasants fashioned containers from clay, wood, and animal skins to store grains and dried goods safely. Simple carpentry tools enabled repairs to homes and barns. Peasants used clay, straw, and animal hair as insulating materials, applied with hand tools and improvised implements. Winter shaped family dynamics and child-rearing practices. Keeping infants and children warm was vital. Families used layered clothing, swaddling, and shared sleeping arrangements to conserve heat. Even young children contributed by tending animals, helping gather firewood, or assisting with household chores inside the home. Winter births were risky due to cold and limited midwifery help. Death rates spiked in infants and elders, and families adapted rituals to honor and remember loved ones within the constraints of winter. With limited daylight and outdoor activity, evenings were often spent in oral storytelling, passing down knowledge, values, and entertainment to younger generations. Long winters brought physical hardship and mental challenges. Shared hardship fostered solidarity. Collective activities like weaving, singing, and communal meals uplifted spirits. Legends, folktales, and songs offered escape and meaning. Stories of heroes, saints, and mythical creatures kept hope alive and imparted lessons for survival. Humor, jokes, and playful competitions helped relieve stress and prevent despair. Festivals and gatherings punctuated the monotony of winter, rekindling joy. As winter waned, peasants prepared to shift from survival mode to renewal. With better weather, peasants repaired fences, thatched roofs, and farming implements in preparation for planting. Seeds saved from the previous harvest were carefully sorted and stored. Planting crop, rotation, and field assignments began even before snow melted. Winter breeding cycles for livestock were managed carefully to ensure spring births. Grazing pastures were monitored as snow receded. Spring festivals and rituals honored the changing season, giving peasants renewed hope and motivation for the coming year. In medieval times, one of the greatest challenges peasants faced was ensuring a stable food supply throughout the long and harsh winter months. Fresh produce quickly vanished once the frost set in, and fields lay dormant under snow. To bridge this gap, peasants ingeniously relied on root cellars and underground storage tested methods that preserved the bounty of harvest and sustained communities until spring. Root cellars were typically simple but carefully constructed subterranean chambers, dug beneath or near peasant homes or barns. Their location was no accident. Peasants understood the need for stable soil that would insulate the food against freezing temperatures while keeping moisture at a level that prevented rot. If the soil was too wet or poorly drained, vegetables would spoil, too dry or exposed, and they would freeze. Finding this balance was critical and passed down as communal knowledge. These cellars were often lined or insulated with straw, hay, moss, or even layers of wood to regulate humidity and temperature. The airflow was minimal but sufficient to prevent mold buildup. An entrance. These were kept small and covered with wooden lids or earth. Inside, peasants stored hardy root vegetables such as carrots, parsnips, turnips, beets, and onion crops capable of surviving months underground without spoiling. Besides root vegetables, peasants also stored grains like wheat, rye, and barley in these cool environments, sometimes placing them in woven baskets or clay pots sealed with wax or pitch to keep out pests and moisture. When available, dried legumes and nuts were also tucked away. In regions with colder climates, some peasants created double, layered cellars or built their storage spaces within hillside slopes to maximize insulation. These adaptations allowed communities across different geographies to employ similar survival tactics despite varying conditions. The communal knowledge surrounding cellar building and maintenance was vital. Improper storage meant entire winter stores could be lost, leading to hunger or worse. Meat was a precious commodity for medieval peasants. While not a daily staple, it played a crucial role in the winter diet, providing concentrated calories and nutrients when plant foods were scarce. However, fresh meat quickly spoiled without refrigeration, so preservation techniques were essential. One of the most common methods was smoking. Peasants constructed simple smoke houses in wooden frameworks covered with bark, hides, or thatch adjacent to their homes or barns. In these structures, meats and fish were hung from rafters or wooden hooks above smoldering wood fires. The slow infusion of smoke, along with the drying effect of the heat, cured the food by inhibiting bacterial growth. The choice of wood was important. Hard woods such as oak or beech produced denser smoke and better flavors, while softwoods could introduce unwanted resinous tastes. Peasants learned through experience which woods yielded the best results for preservation and taste. Salting was another widespread technique, though salt itself was a valuable and sometimes scarce resource. Peasants who had access to salt works or could trade for salt used it to cure pork, beef, and fish. Large cuts of meat were rubbed or layered with salt, then packed tightly into barrels or ceramic jars. The salt drew out moisture and created an environment hostile to bacteria. Small fish, such as herrings, were often salted whole and dried or smoked afterward for longer storage. In coastal regions, salted cod stockfish was a major winter food export, though peasants also benefited from similar preservation methods. Drying meats and herbs in the sun or over open fires was more common in warmer months, but contributed to winter supplies. Peasants understood that properly dried foods, when stored away from moisture and pests, could last for many months. These preservation methods required knowledge, labor, and resources, making meat a winter luxury in many peasant households. Nevertheless, even small amounts enhanced nutrition and morale during the cold months. Preserving vegetables through pickling and fermentation was another critical survival strategy for medieval peasants. The bitter cold eliminated most fresh produce, so storing vegetables in brine or vinegar ensured a supply of vital nutrients. Commonly pickled vegetables included cabbage, which fermented into sauerkraut, cucumbers, onions, and sometimes even fruits like apples or berries. The process not only extended shelf life, but also enhanced digestibility and provided beneficial probiotics, supporting health during winter. Fermentation extended beyond vegetables. Sourdough bread, made with natural wild yeasts and bacteria, was a staple food whose fermentation improved flavor and nutritional quality. Peasants carefully nurtured their sourdough starters, passing them between families and generations. Fermented alcoholic beverages such as beer and cider were common winter staples. These drinks provided warmth, calories, and safer hydration than often contaminated water sources. Brewing was a vital winter activity, with households or small-scale village brewers producing beer from barley or rye. The preparation of these fermented foods and drinks required skill, timing, and hygienic conditions, which peasants managed with practical knowledge developed over generations. Despite all preservation efforts, medieval peasants constantly battled the threats of food spoilage. Mold, rot, insect infestation, and rodents posed persistent dangers to winter stores. Losing stored food meant starvation or serious hardship. Peasants adopted several strategies to combat spoilage. Containers were tightly sealed using clay, wax, pitch, or animal fats to keep moisture and pests out. Herbs such as lavender, rosemary, and mint, known for their insect-repellent properties, were often stored with grains and seeds. Regular inspections were part of daily or weekly routines, checking for signs of rot or infestation. Spoiled items were quickly discarded or cooked to salvage nutrients. Sometimes, certain spoiled foods could be used for animal feed or compost. The ever-present risk of spoilage made rationing a careful and vital practice. Food was divided sparingly, often prioritizing the most vulnerable children, the elderly, and the ill. Food storage and preservation were an art as much as a science, requiring knowledge, vigilance, and adaptation to seasonal conditions. In medieval peasant life, animals were not merely property. They were vital partners in survival, especially through the unforgiving winter months. Livestock provided milk, wool, labor, and sometimes meat, making their care a critical concern when temperatures dropped and food grew scarce. Peasants understood the importance of sheltering their animals from biting winds, deep snow, and icy rains. Most villages had barns or animal sheds attached to homes or clustered nearby. These structures were often built with thick wattle and daub walls or stone foundations, topped with thatched roofs, designed to shield animals from the worst elements. Inside these shelters, animals huddled together to share body warmth. Peasants used straw, hay, or rushes as bedding, replenished regularly to keep the floors dry and insulated. The warmth generated by the animals themselves helped maintain a microclimate above freezing, protecting sensitive livestock like cows, sheep, and pigs from frostbite or hypothermia. Winter feeding was a constant challenge. Fresh pasture was unavailable, so peasants harvested and stored fodder throughout the warmer, month-streed grasses, hay, turnip tops, and root vegetables like swedes or mangel-wurzels became critical. Feeding animals sufficient food was vital, as malnourished livestock weakened and succumbed to illness, directly affecting the household's survival. Water, too, was a concern. Frozen streams and wells complicated access, requiring peasants to break ice or carry water indoors. The care of working animals such as oxen and horses was especially important, as they were essential for hauling firewood, plowing, or transport during winter tasks. If an animal fell ill or died, it was a serious blow, reducing a family's capacity to perform essential labor or secure food. Peasants also practiced rudimentary animal health care, using herbal remedies to treat minor ailments, reflecting the interconnectedness of human and animal welfare. Among the many gifts animals offered, wool was arguably the most crucial for winter survival. Sheep were prized not only for their meat, but especially for the insulating fleece that could be transformed into warm clothing and bedding. Wool production was a year-round task. Sheep were sheared in late spring or early summer, the fleece carefully cleaned, carded, and spun into yarn by skilled women, often the wives, daughters, or specialized spinners in the village. This yarn was then woven into cloth using simple wooden looms, sometimes within the home or in small community workshops. The quality of wool varied based on breed, diet, and local climate. Coarser wool was used for heavy outer garments such as cloaks and coats, while finer wool was reserved for undergarments or children's clothing. Peasants understood layering and thickness were key to staying warm. Woolen garments trapped air, providing insulation even when damp from snow or rain. Wool was also used to make blankets and mattress stuffing, adding warmth during the long nights. Besides clothing, wool served as a trade good or rent payment to landlords, making it economically significant beyond mere survival. The medieval peasant's relationship with animals went beyond utility. It was one of respect, interdependence, and even spiritual connection. Animals were seen as living beings deserving care, and their health was intimately tied to family well-being. Stories, folklore, and religious beliefs often featured animals as symbols of fertility, protection, or labor. For example, oxen were sometimes blessed during religious festivals to ensure their strength and health through winter. This bond manifested in daily routines. Feeding, grooming, and sheltering livestock was a form of stewardship, a sacred duty passed down through generations. Animals also provided emotional comfort in harsh times, their presence alleviating isolation and despair during cold, dark months. In some cases, peasants shared their living quarters with smaller animals like chickens or cats, which helped control pests and added warmth. The symbiotic relationship with animals was crucial in a world without modern conveniences. Both were essential for enduring the coldest nights and toughest winters. In medieval peasant homes, the hearth was much more than a place to cook. It was the heart of the household, a vital source of warmth and a center for daily life, especially during the bitter winter months. Without modern heating technologies, the fire's glow was the primary defense against cold, and how it was built, maintained, and managed could mean the difference between life and death. Most peasant cottages had a large open hearth situated centrally or against a main wall. Constructed from stone or clay, it was designed to contain the fire safely while radiating heat into the living space. The fire was fed continuously during winter evenings and nights, often burning low embers to conserve fuel while maintaining warmth. The hearth also served as a cooking area. Pots were suspended over the flames, and food was prepared here. Hot broths and stews that provided essential calories and warmth. The crackling fire offered not just heat, but light and a social focal point around which families gathered to share stories, mend clothing, and plan for the days ahead. Fuel was the lifeblood of winter survival. Peasants harvested wood from local forests or coppices, gathering fallen branches or cutting small trees under village regulations designed to prevent deforestation. Firewood was stored carefully to keep dry, often stacked near the home or in sheds to ensure it would ignite easily. In regions where trees were scarce, peat, partially decomposed plant material harvested from bogs, was a common alternative. Peat bricks were cut, dried, and burned in hearths or small stoves. Though peat produced less heat and more smoke than wood, It was a crucial resource for many. Occasionally, dried animal dung was used as fuel, especially where wood was scarce. While not ideal, it provided necessary warmth in desperate times. Managing fuel consumption was a daily task. Too little fire meant cold and sickness. Too much exhausted precious resources. Peasants learned to balance fire size, burn time, and fuel supply carefully. While fire was essential, it was also a constant hazard. Wooden cottages with thatched roofs were highly flammable, and open hearths posed risks of accidental sparks or smoke inhalation. Peasants developed strategies to reduce these dangers. Hearths were surrounded by stone or clay to prevent fires from spreading. Chimneys or simple smoke vents were often constructed, though imperfect litho-channel smoke outdoors. Some homes had smoke holes in the roof, which also helped regulate airflow. Keeping the hearth area clear of flammable materials, regularly cleaning soot and ash, and supervising fires carefully were everyday practices. Nighttime fires were kept low or banked with ash, is to prevent flare-ups. Village is sometimes organized communal fire watch is during particularly dry seasons, and shared knowledge of basic firefighting techniques, such as smothering flames with earth or water. Despite these precautions, devastating fires were common, capable of destroying entire hamlets. The memory of such tragedies reinforced the cautious respect peasants held for fire. Beyond the hearth, peasants used additional methods to stay warm. Portable braziers or iron pots filled with hot coals were occasionally brought indoors, providing localized heat, especially in sleeping areas. Beds were often insulated with multiple layers of blankets, furs, and straw mattress, is to trap heat during cold nights. In some regions, heated stones were wrapped in cloth and placed near the feet for extra warmth. Clothing and body heat were crucial supplements to open fires. Peasants often huddled together for warmth, sharing body heat in small sleeping quarters. These combined methods created a layered defense against coldone that required constant attention, labor, and skill. Before the snow began to fall and temperatures plunged, medieval peasants entered a crucial period of intense labor and preparation. The harvest season was their final opportunity to gather, preserve, and store enough food and fuel to survive the coming winter months. Crops like wheat, rye, barley, oats, and various vegetables were harvested by hand using sickles and scythes. The work was backbreaking and time-sensitive. Failure to harvest before the first frosts could mean losing much of the year's yield. Once gathered, grains were threshed to separate the edible kernels from the stalks, a communal task, often involving entire families or village groups. Grain was then winnowed to remove chaff, stored in granaries, or packed into sacks for winter use. Root vegetables such as turnips, parsnips, and carrots were dug up and transported carefully to root cellars. These underground chambers were cleaned and prepared to receive the crops, with floors layered in dry straw to absorb moisture. Peasants also stockpiled firewood, cutting, splitting, and stacking logs for optimal drying. Hay for animal fodder was gathered, dried, and stored in barns. This season was a race against time and weather, and the community's collective effort was critical to survival. Winter was also a time of rich cultural and spiritual significance. Festivals such as Yule, Christmas, and Candlemas marked key points in the seasonal calendar. While deeply religious, these celebrations also had practical functions tied to survival. During these festivals, villagers shared food, drink, and warmth, reinforcing communal bonds vital for enduring winter's hardships. The sharing of preserved meats, ale, and baked goods offered physical nourishment and emotional comfort. Rituals often involved blessing homes, livestock, and tools to protect against disease, cold, and misfortune. Lighting candles and fires during the darkest days symbolized hope and the return of light. Some customs had agricultural significance, such as the first planting rituals or the sowing of protective seeds indoors, meant to ensure a fruitful spring. These seasonal rites strengthened community cohesion, boosted morale, and aligned daily survival with spiritual meaning. Winter forced a change in the pace and nature of peasant work. The harsh weather limited outdoor activities, reducing field labor but increasing indoor or sheltered tasks. Mending tools, repairing clothing, making candles, spinning wool, and weaving became winter staples. These activities prepared peasants for spring and maintained essential household needs. Periods of rest were also vital. After months of exhausting labor, winter allowed time for recovery and reflection. Peasants valued these moments, understanding that conserving energy was key to survival. Rest was not simply idleness, but a strategic adaptation, balancing labor with the body's limits in cold conditions. Winter presented medieval peasants with one of their greatest challenges: sustaining adequate nutrition when fresh food was scarce or non-existent. With fields lying fallow beneath snow and frost, peasants had to rely heavily on what they had prepared and preserved during the bountiful months of spring, summer, and autumn. Peasants understood that hunger and malnutrition were serious risks during winter, weakening the body's defenses and increasing vulnerability to illness and cold. Their survival depended on careful planning, effective preservation techniques, and ingenious use of limited resources. Preservation was an art passed down through generations, combining empirical knowledge with practical necessity. Without refrigeration, peasants employed several methods to extend the life of their food. Drying. Herbs, grains, fruits, and vegetables were dried in the sun or near fires. Drying removed moisture, preventing spoilage. Apples, herbs like thyme and sage, and even mushrooms were common items dried for winter use. Peasants strung them in bunches or spread them on mats or racks. Salting and curing. Salt was a precious commodity but invaluable for preserving meat and fish. Peasants salted cuts of pork or beef, packing them tightly in barrels with layers of salt to draw out moisture and inhibit bacterial growth. This cured meat could last for months and was an important protein source during winter. Smoking, in regions with access to wood and smokehouses, meat and fish were smoked over low heat for days or weeks. This method added flavor while also preserving food. Pickling. Vegetables like cabbage and onions were pickled in brine or vinegar. This not only preserved them, but also provided important vitamins during winter when fresh produce was unavailable. Sauerkraut, fermented cabbage, was a staple in many northern peasant diets. Storage in root cellars. Root vegetables and hardy fruits like apples were stored in cool, dark, and humid cellars or pits lined with straw. These conditions slowed spoilage and kept produce edible through months of winter. Honey and syrups. Honey, often harvested from wild or domesticated hives, was used as a natural preservative and sweetener. It was added to preserves or stored separately as an energy-rich food. Peasant winter diets were shaped by availability, preservation methods, and social status. While the wealthier had access to varied foods, the average peasant's diet was simpler but surprisingly varied. Grains and bread. Coarse breads made from rye or barley were daily staples, often accompanied by pottage-thick soups or stews made with grains, legumes, and whatever vegetables or scraps were available. Legumes and pulses, beans, peas, and lentils provided essential protein and were often dried for winter use. They were slow, cooked in stews or pottage, to maximize nourishment. Preserved meats and fish, salted pork or bacon, smoked fish, or dried venison were occasional but treasured protein sources. Dairy products. In households with animals, cheese and butter supplemented the diet. though dairy production declined in deep winter as animals ate less. Vegetables, root crops like turnips, parsnips, and carrots featured prominently. Pickled vegetables added flavor and nutrients. Fats and oils. Animal fats rendered from meat scraps or butter were critical for cooking and caloric intake. Drinks, ale and weak beer were consumed regularly, often safer than water, which could be contaminated or frozen. Herbal teas made from dried plants provided warmth and medicinal benefits. Food was not merely fuel, but central to peasant culture and community. Sharing meals fostered bonds and mutual support, essential in harsh conditions. Communal baking, for instance, was common, with villagers using shared ovens or hearths. Certain foods were associated with festivals or rituals, marking seasonal transitions or religious holidays. The winter solstice, Christmas, and Candlemas often featured special foods or feasts, reinforcing social ties and spiritual hope. Food scarcity also shaped attitudes toward resourcefulness and thrift. Nothing was waste. Bones were boiled for broth, vegetable scraps composted or fed to animals, and leftovers creatively reused. Despite their best efforts, medieval peasants often faced nutritional deficiencies during winter, notably scurvy from lack of fresh vitamin C. However, traditional remedies such as pickled vegetables and herbal infusions helped mitigate some deficiencies. The seasonal rhythm of food availability affected energy levels and health. Winters were marked by slower activity and increased vulnerability to illness, but the preserved food supply was a vital lifeline. Peasants' intimate knowledge of food preparation and preservation was a testament to their adaptability and resilience factors in enduring the coldest nights and harshest seasons. Clothing was one of the most critical elements in medieval peasant survival during winter. Without the insulation of modern materials or central heating, proper garments were essential to retaining body heat and preventing illness. Clothing functioned as a barrier against cold winds, snow, and dampness factors that could quickly sap body warmth and lead to hypothermia or respiratory diseases. Peasants understood that layering clothes was key. Multiple garments worn together trapped warm air close to the skin, providing insulation far more effective than a single thick piece. Most clothing was made from natural fibers available locally. Wool was the dominant material, prized for its insulating properties even when wet. Sheep's wool could be spun into yarn and woven into dense fabrics, ranging from coarse cloth for outerwear to finer weaves for undergarments. Linen made from flax was commonly used for underclothes due to its breathability and comfort against the skin. Although less warm than wool, linen was valuable in managing sweat and moisture. Silk and fine fabrics were rare and typically reserved for wealthier classes. Peasants might acquire small scraps through trade or gifts, but these were exceptions. The medieval peasant's winter wardrobe was functional and layered. Undergarments, linen shirts or shifts, formed the base layer. These long garments protected the skin and helped wick moisture away. Tunics and kirtles, woolen tunics or kirtles, a type of dress or long shirt, were worn over the undergarments. These provided warmth and some protection from wind. Hose and leg wrappings. Legs were covered with woolen hose or wrapped with strips of cloth or leather, protecting against cold and mud. Cloaks and mantles, heavy wool cloaks, often lined with fur or fleece, served as outer layers. These garments could be pulled tightly around the body to block drafts. Head coverings, hats, hoods, or coifs were essential to conserve body heat, as much warmth escapes through the head. Footwear, leather boots or shoes, sometimes lined with wool or fur, kept feet warm and dry. Peasants often wore wooden clogs outdoors to elevate their feet above wet or snowy ground. Clothing production was a labor-intensive process involving multiple steps shearing. Sheep were sheared, usually in late spring or early summer. Cleaning and carding. Wool was cleaned of dirt and debris, then carded to align fibers. Spinning. Women spun the wool into yarn using spinning wheels or drop spindles. Weaving. Yarn was woven into fabric on looms, often operated within the household or village. Sewing and mending. Garments were hand-stitched and carefully mended to extend their life, reflecting the value placed on textile goods. The cyclical nature of clothing production meant that winter was often a time for sewing and repairing garments, as outdoor work diminished. Beyond utility, clothing conveyed social status, occupation, and regional identity. While peasants generally wore simple and durable garments, colors, trims, and garment styles varied according to local customs. Dyes were typically derived from plants, lichens, or insects, producing earthy tones. Bright colors were rare and expensive, often reserved for special occasions. Clothing also played a role in religious observance. Certain garments might be donned for festivals or rituals, symbolizing purification or protection. Winter clothing had limitations. Wet conditions could soak wool, reducing its insulating ability, while poor quality garments might allow drafts or chafing. Peasants adapted by layering, using furs for extra warmth, and taking care to keep clothes dry. Despite their best efforts, cold-related illnesses and discomfort were common. Yet, the skillful production and use of textiles remained a cornerstone of medieval peasant survival through coldest nights. Water was essential for survival, but in medieval villages, securing clean water during winter was a challenge. Wells and springs could freeze, and rivers or streams were often clogged with ice and snow. Peasants had to develop strategies to access, store, and conserve water during the coldest months. Villages often relied on wells, which, if deep enough, remained unfrozen. Surface water, however, had to be broken through ice to retrieve. Peasants sometimes melted snow or ice over fires to obtain water for cooking and washing. Water was also rationed carefully, especially since fetching it required venturing into the cold, sometimes risky terrain. Medieval peasants had a complex relationship with hygiene. Bathing was far less frequent than today, particularly in winter, when exposure to cold water was believed to cause illness. Instead, peasants maintained cleanliness through regular washing of hands, face, and feet, often with cold water or herbal infusions. Dry washing, rubbing the skin with cloth or sand, was sometimes used when water was scarce. Linen undergarments, which absorbed sweat and dirt, were changed and washed more regularly, helping maintain personal hygiene. Sanitation infrastructure was minimal. Most peasants relied on simple latrines, often located outside the main living quarters. These were typically pits or rudimentary outhouses. In winter, the frozen ground complicated waste disposal, making latrine pits harder to dig and maintain. Some waste accumulated until spring thaw, increasing the risk of contamination. Villages often had communal rules for waste disposal to protect water sources. Keeping refuse away from wells and streams was vital to prevent disease outbreaks. Cold weather slowed decomposition, reducing odor and the spread of some pathogens. However, cramped living quarters with poor ventilation increased exposure to respiratory illnesses. Smoke from indoor fires helped disinfect the air somewhat, but also contributed to eye and lung irritation. Winter was a time of increased disease risk, partly due to these sanitation challenges. Peasants coped with this by maintaining as much cleanliness as feasible, using herbal fumigations, and relying on community knowledge. Water held spiritual significance. Holy water was used to bless homes, livestock, and the sick, believed to ward off evil and disease. Herbal infusions and water-based poultices were common remedies for winter ailments. Warm water mixed with herbs soothed respiratory problems, and steam inhalation was sometimes practiced. Water's practical and symbolic roles intertwined, reinforcing its importance in daily and spiritual life. The humble homes of medieval peasants were ingeniously designed to withstand the harsh cold, despite their simple materials and construction methods. Most peasants lived in 1- or 2-room cottages made from local resources such as timber, wattle, and daub woven sticks covered with mud, stone, or turf. Roofs were typically thatched with straw or reeds, which provided natural insulation and helped shed rain and snow. The compact size of these homes minimized heat loss and made it easier to keep warm. Windows were small, often just holes covered with oiled parchment, cloth, or wooden shutters to reduce drafts while letting in limited light. Glass was rare and expensive. Peasants employed several insulation techniques to keep their homes warm during winter. Thick walls made from wattle and daub or stone were thick, providing thermal mass that absorbed heat during the day and released it slowly at night. Straw and rush mats. Straw or rushes were spread on floors and sometimes hung on walls to provide additional insulation and soften the living area. Furs and textiles. Animal skins and woolen blankets were hung on walls or placed over doors and windows to block cold air. Compact furnishings. Furniture like benches and beds were tightly arranged to conserve space and trap heat. The central hearth was the heart of the peasant home, providing warmth and a place to cook. Typically, it was a simple stone or earthen fire pit located in the center or corner of the room. Smoke management was rudimentary. Many cottages had no chimneys. Smoke escaped through thatched roofs or small holes, creating smoky interiors but also helping repel insects and preserve meat. Despite the discomfort, the hearth's warmth was critical to survival. Fires burned throughout the day and often all night during the coldest spells. Sleeping quarters were arranged to maximize warmth. Beds were typically raised wooden platforms filled with straw or rushes and covered with wool blankets or animal furs. Families often slept close together, sharing body heat. In many homes, animals such as dogs or even livestock were kept in adjoining spaces or under the same roof to provide additional warmth. Peasants made seasonal modifications to their homes as winter approached. Doors and windows were sealed as tightly as possible with cloth, mud, or wooden planks. Additional bedding was prepared, and storage areas for food and fuel were organized to reduce time spent outdoors in freezing weather. While these homes offered protection, they were not impervious to cold. Drafts, dampness, and smoky air were persistent challenges. Peasants adapted by layering clothing indoors, maintaining constant fires, and organizing daily routines around the availability of warmth. For medieval peasants, livestock was not merely a source of food, but a crucial component of winter survival strategy. Animals provided meat, milk, hides, wool, and labor, all of which were essential when cold weather and frozen fields restricted crop production. The well-being of livestock directly affected a family's ability to endure the harsh months, making animal care a winter priority. During winter, peasants sheltered their animals to protect them from freezing temperatures, snow, and wind. Stables, barns, or simple shelters built close to the home provided a barrier against the elements. Some animals, like pigs, were kept in pens filled with straw for insulation. Cattle and sheep were often housed in communal barns shared among several families, which conserved heat and made management more efficient. Proper shelter reduced the risk of animal illness and loss, which could devastate a peasant's livelihood. With pastures covered in snow, peasants had to provide stored fodder such as hay, straw, root vegetables like turnips and carrots, and leftover grains to feed their animals. The careful preservation and rationing of animal feed were vital, as starvation or malnutrition among livestock threatened food supplies for the household. Dairy was a winter staple where animals were available. Cows, goats, and sheep provided milk, which was consumed fresh, turned into cheese, or churned into butter. Cheese, especially hard cheeses, could be stored for months, offering a crucial protein and fat source when meat was scarce. Wool sheared from sheep was spun and woven into textiles, reinforcing the link between livestock and clothing production. Animals also contributed warmth. Sleeping near or in barns with animals helped preserve body heat. Beyond food and warmth, animals like oxen and horses provided labor. Even in winter, peasants relied on them for hauling firewood, transporting goods, or plowing fields during brief thaw periods. Winter posed risks to livestock. Cold stress, disease, and limited food often resulted in losses. Peasants adapted by breeding hardy local breeds accustomed to cold climates and using knowledge of animal care to mitigate risks. Losing animals was a blow to survival, but also reshaped the household economy and labor distribution. Livestock ownership was linked to social status within the village and economic resilience. Sharing or lending animals was common during winter hardships, reflecting communal interdependence. The care and management of livestock were not merely economic acts, but woven into social fabric and seasonal rhythms. Winter posed severe challenges to food availability and nutrition for medieval peasants. With fields lying fallow and fresh produce scarce, diets became more limited and heavily reliant on preserved and stored foods. The risk of malnutrition, scurvy, and related diseases increased during the cold months, making food preservation and careful rationing essential. The peasant diet centered around a few key staples. Grains, barley, rye, oats, and wheat were harvested in late summer or early autumn and stored for winter use. These grains were ground into coarse flour or meal for bread and porridge. Legumes, beans, peas, and lentils were dried and stored. These protein-rich foods supplemented the diet during lean months. Root vegetables, carrots, turnips, parsnips, and onions were harvested in autumn and kept in root cellars or pits to stay fresh through winter. Preserved meats and fish, salted, smoked, or dried meats and fish provided vital protein and fat. However, fresh meat was rare and typically reserved for special occasions, or when animals were slaughtered in late autumn. Preservation techniques were critical to winter survival. Salting and smoking. Salt was used to cure meat and fish, inhibiting bacterial growth. Smoking added flavor and further preservation. Drying, herbs, fruits, and some meats were dried to extend shelf life. Pickling and fermentation. Vegetables and fruits were sometimes pickled in brine or fermented to retain nutrients and provide variety. Storage, root cellars, pits lined with straw, or cool underground rooms helped keep perishables from freezing or rotting. Meals were simple and repetitive, but carefully designed for sustenance. Pottage, a thick stew or porridge made from grains, vegetables, and occasionally meat or fish. Pottage was filling and easy to digest, often eaten multiple times a day. Bread, coarse, dense bread made from rye or barley, was a staple at every meal. Soups and broths, made from bones, herbs, and available vegetables. These provided warmth and nutrition. Cheese and dairy, where available, cheese and butter supplemented diets with fats and proteins. Winter diets were often deficient in fresh vitamins, leading to ailments such as scurvy from lack of vitamin C and rickets from vitamin D deficiency. Peasants relied on wild greens, preserved herbs, and limited fresh foods to mitigate these deficiencies, but health issues were common. Winter food traditions involved communal feasting around festivals like Christmas and Candlemas, providing psychological relief and social bonding. Fast days and religious observance is also influenced diet, with restrictions on meat or dairy on certain days. Peasants showed resilience by innovating with available resource, growing hardy winter crops, experimenting with preservation, and exchanging foodstuffs with neighbors. Food was not just fuel, but a vital element of survival strategy, intertwined with social and spiritual life. Winter was a season of both hardship and adaptation for medieval peasants. The harsh cold and shorter daylight hours naturally curtailed many outdoor farming activities. Fields lay fallow under blankets of snow or frozen ground, making typical crop work impossible. Yet, winter was far from a time of complete idleness. Peasants engaged in essential tasks vital for their survival and preparation for the upcoming agricultural year. Winter work was characterized by a balance between conserving energy and ensuring that necessary coarse fuel gathering, animal care, repairs, and food processing were accomplished efficiently. This balance was critical, as overexertion in freezing conditions could lead to illness or injury, while neglecting duties threatened survival. A significant portion of winter labor involved caring for livestock. Animals were indispensable assets, providing milk, wool, labor, and, in times of scarcity, meat. Feeding, since grazing was impossible on frozen ground, peasants fed animals stored fodder such as hay, root vegetables, turnips, carrots, and straw. This required daily effort to transport feed from storage to shelters. Sheltering and maintenance. Maintaining animal shelters was crucial. Peasants repaired barns, replenished bedding straw, and ensured adequate ventilation to prevent respiratory diseases without exposing animals to drafts. Health monitoring. Close observation for signs of illness, injury, or frost helped reduce losses during winter's harshest days. Fire was the centerpiece of winter survival, providing warmth and a means to cook food. Gathering and managing fuel was therefore a continuous winter activity. Woodcutting. Winter was sometimes chosen for cutting and gathering firewood, as frozen ground could support heavy carts. Without damage, dead wood was collected from forests or common lands. Storing fuel, peasants carefully stocked wood piles near homes and shelters, ensuring dry storage to maintain burnability. Alternative fuels. When wood was scarce, peasants supplemented with peat, dried dung, or crop residues, though these burned less efficiently and produced more smoke. Winter work included processing the autumn harvest to extend food availability. Butchering. Animals were commonly slaughtered in late autumn or early winter, a practice that conserved fodder by reducing livestock numbers before the worst months, and provided meat and fat. Preservation. Salt curing, smoking, drying, and fermenting meat, fish, and vegetables occupied much time during colder months. Cooking. Daily meal preparation involved heating thick pottages, soups, or porridges over open fires, a task often done indoors to avoid exposure to cold. With fieldwork reduced, peasants shifted to maintenance and craft activities critical to household and village functionality. Repairing tools and buildings. Winter was an ideal time to mend agricultural tools, fix thatched roofs, patch walls, and sharpen blades. Textile production. Spinning wool, weaving cloth, and sewing or patching garments were vital to clothing production and repair, often conducted by women and children indoors. Making household items, carving wooden utensils, baskets, and simple furniture also kept peasants occupied. Despite constant demands, peasants observed natural and religious rhythms that allowed for rest. Reduced daylight. Short winter days limited outdoor work hours, encouraging early rest and conserving energy. Festivals and holy days. Winter featured numerous religious holidays: Christmas, New Year, Epiphany, Candlemas, when labor paused, and communities gathered for worship, feasting, and socializing. Rest and recuperation. These periods of reduced activity and celebration boosted morale and reinforced communal bonds, helping peasants endure winter's psychological toll. Many winter tasks were communal, reflecting the interdependence of village life, shared labor, firewood gathering, repairs, and threshing grain were often done collectively, distributing workload and sharing resources. Mutual aid. Neighbors helped each other during particularly severe weather or illness, ensuring the survival of the community. Knowledge exchange. Winter gatherings facilitated the passing of agricultural knowledge, folk wisdom, and planning for the coming year. The medieval peasants' approach to winter work was a finely tuned balance between action and conservation, community and individual effort. These seasonal labors not only sustained life through the cold months, but prepared the soil, tools, and spirit for the coming growing season. Winter was a demanding, often harsh time that shaped peasant culture and survival strategies profoundly. Through resilience, adaptation, and cooperation, medieval peasants met these challenges, year after year, embodying a deep connection to the land and rhythms of nature. Water was essential for survival, used for drinking, cooking, cleaning, and livestock care. Yet, winter introduced unique challenges. In many regions, wells, springs, and surface water sources froze over, complicating access. Peasants had to adapt their routines and develop strategies to secure sufficient water during the coldest months. Peasants relied on several water sources during winter. Wells. Many villages had wells dug near homes or communal areas. Though wells could freeze at the surface, drawing water from below was often possible with tools or by breaking ice. Streams and rivers. Flowing water was less prone to freezing completely, but access was dangerous in icy conditions. Peasants often had to break ice or collect water from edges. Snow and ice. In extreme cold, snow and ice were collected and melted over fires. While resourceful, this method was time-consuming and provided limited quantities. Stored rainwater. In some regions, cisterns or barrels collected rainwater during warmer months and were tapped in winter. Transporting water in winter was laborious. Peasants used wooden buckets or leather pouches to carry water from wells or streams to homes. To prevent freezing, water was often kept indoors near the hearth, in large ceramic or wooden containers. Regular replenishment and careful handling prevented contamination. Hygiene in medieval times was dictated both by necessity and prevailing beliefs. In winter, cold temperatures and scarce warm water influenced practices. Bathing. Full-body bathing was infrequent year-round and especially avoided during winter due to the risk of chills and illness. Instead, washing face and hands with cold water was common. Clothing and linen washing. Clothes and bedding were washed less frequently in winter due to frozen water sources and difficulty drying fabrics. Peasants often aired garments near fires or outdoors on warmer days. Oral hygiene. Chewing herbs like mint or sage was practiced for freshening breath, while rinsing with water or herbal infusions was common. Sanitation posed challenges that intensified in winter. Outdoor latrines. These were sometimes inaccessible due to snow or ice, leading to temporary indoor solutions like chamber pots. Waste disposal. Disposal of household waste was more difficult in winter. Peasants stored refuse for spring removal or burned it in hearth fires when possible. Although medieval understanding of germs was limited, peasants recognized that cleanliness could prevent disease spread. Keeping homes relatively clean, airing out bedding, and using smoke from fires to purify air were practical strategies. Herbal smoke and incense were sometimes used indoors as insect repellents and for perceived health benefits. Water held symbolic and spiritual importance. Holy water was used in blessings and protection rituals, especially in winter when sickness was prevalent. Religious practice emphasized purity, and some believed that cleanliness warded off evil spirits. Despite limited means and harsh conditions, medieval peasants adapted water access and hygiene practice, is to sustain health through winter. Their resourcefulness in overcoming frozen wells, scarcity of warm water, and sanitation challenge highlights the ingenuity required to survive the coldest months. Water and hygiene, while often overlooked in historical narratives, were fundamental to medieval peasant endurance and well-being. The medieval peasant's home was their primary defense against the brutal cold of winter nights. With no modern heating or insulation technologies, peasants had to use every available material and design strategy to keep warmth inside and cold out. Shelter was not merely a place to sleep. It was the center of family life, food preparation, craftwork, and socializing, all activities that required a space that could preserve heat as effectively as possible. Peasant homes were typically constructed from locally available materials such as timber, wattle and daub, stone, and turf. These materials had differing properties in terms of insulation. Wattle and daub, a common method involving woven wooden strips, wattle plastered with mud, clay, straw, and manure daub. This thick mixture provided reasonable insulation and sealed gaps against wind. Timber frames, strong wooden frameworks provided structure but required infill for insulation. Spaces were often filled with daub, or sometimes with straw or moss. Stone walls. In some regions, houses had thick stone walls which stored heat during the day and radiated it slowly at night, though stone could also be cold and damp. Thatch roofs. Roofs made from straw or reeds offered good insulation by trapping air and protecting against rain and snow. Earthen floors. Floors made from packed earth or clay were common but cold. Peasants often covered floors with rushes, straw, or animal hides to reduce chill. Peasants used various methods to improve insulation within their homes. Wall hangings and tapestries. Though rare among the poorest, some homes hung cloth or animal skins on walls to reduce drafts. Straw and rushes. Layers of straw or rushes were spread on floors and between walls and roofs, acting as natural insulators. Door and window seals. Cracks around doors and windows were plugged with straw, cloth, or mud to block cold air. Small windows. Windows were often small to reduce heat loss, sometimes covered with oiled parchment or animal horn to admit light while keeping out drafts. The open hearth was crucial for warmth and cooking. Positioned centrally or against a wall, the hearth was a constant source of heat. Fire management. Peasants maintained fires carefully, adding wood regularly and managing smoke ventilation through chimneys or smoke holes. Heat distribution. The heat radiated from the fire warmed the room's central area. However, homes were often divided into one or two rooms, so heat loss to other parts was a challenge. Smoke benefits and drawbacks. Smoke could irritate eyes and lungs, but also helped repel insects and added a slight warming effect by circulating air. At night, warmth retention was critical. Beds. Peasants slept on wooden frames or straw-filled mattress is covered with wool or linen sheets. Bedding. Heavy woolen blankets, animal furs, and sheepskins were layered for insulation. Shared sleeping. Families often shared beds or slept close together on the floor to conserve body heat. Bed curtains. In some cases, curtains were hung around beds to trap heat in a smaller space. Even within their homes, peasants often wore several layers of clothing during winter nights. Staying clothed while sleeping was common, reflecting the inadequacy of insulation and the importance of body heat. Before winter set in, peasants performed essential maintenance to prepare their homes, repairing roofs and sealing walls to prevent drafts, stocking sufficient firewood inside, reinforcing doors and windows. In some villages, communal buildings like bakehouses, granaries, or village halls provided additional shelter and warmth during social gatherings or emergencies. Medieval peasant shelter was a complex, evolving system blending architecture, materials, and daily practices aimed at survival. The limited resource is pushed peasants to creatively use nature's materials and communal knowledge to create spaces that could withstand harsh winters. Shelter was not a static backdrop, but a living environment constantly adapted to provide warmth, protection, and comfort in a challenging world. For medieval peasants, winter was the season of scarcity. Fresh produce was nearly non-existent, and hunting or gathering was severely limited by weather and frozen landscapes. Therefore, the ability to store and preserve food harvested in warmer months was essential for survival through the coldest, harshest nights and weeks. Effective food storage and preservation methods were not only practical but vital to prevent starvation, maintain health, and endure until the spring thaw. Peasants planned their harvests carefully, gathering crops such as grains, root vegetables, and fruits at optimal times to maximize storage life. Early harvesting of some crops avoided spoilage from autumn rains or frost, while late harvesting aimed to catch produce at peak ripeness. Before storage, food was often cleaned, sorted, and prepared to reduce decay. Drying, herbs, fruits, and some vegetables were sun, dried or smoked to remove moisture and prevent mold. Threshing and winnowing, grain was separated from chaff and cleaned to keep it dry and pest-free. Root crops, potatoes, turnips, carrots, and onions were cured, left in the field or a sheltered area to harden skins, increasing shelf life. Peasant storage spaces were designed to protect food from moisture, pests, and spoilage. Granaries, elevated wooden or stone granaries, kept grain dry and away from rodents. Cellars, underground or partially underground spaces, provided cool, stable temperatures for storing root vegetables, apples, and fermented foods. Drying racks and smokehouses. These structures were used for drying herbs, meats, and fish, using air circulation or smoke to preserve. Clay pots and jars, used for storing liquids like ale, cider, or fermented products, as well as salted or pickled foods. Peasants employed several preservation techniques, often combining methods for best results. Salting, salted meat and fish were common. Salt drew moisture out, inhibiting bacteria growth. Salt was precious and often rationed carefully. Smoking, meat and fish were smoked over low fires for days or weeks, adding flavor and extending edibility. Pickling and fermentation, vegetables were fermented in brine or vinegar, producing foods like sauerkraut, which lasted well into winter and provided vital vitamins. Drying, sun or smoke drying, was used for herbs, fruits, grains, and sometimes meats. Cold storage, snow or ice pits could store perishables at near freezing temperatures. As winter progressed, peasants rationed food carefully. Early winter meals might be more generous, but by late winter, rationing was often strict to ensure survival. Typical winter diet consisted of pottages and soups, thick stews made from grains, dried legumes, root vegetables, and occasional preserved meat or fish. Bread made from stored grain, often coarse and dense. Preserved fruits and vegetables, sauerkraut, pickles, dried apples. Ale and cider, fermented beverages, were a staple, safer than often contaminated water sources. Religious practice is influenced food consumption patterns. Lent and other fasting periods restricted meat and dairy intake, even during winter, requiring peasants to rely more heavily on grains and vegetables. These fasting rules sometimes conflicted with survival needs, but were widely observed as acts of faith. In some villages, food storage and management were communal, especially for grain. Shared granaries and distribution helped buffer the effects of individual crop failures or spoilage. Community cooperation in food preservation reflected the collective struggle against winter scarcity. The art and science of food storage and preservation were among the most vital survival skills medieval peasants mastered. Their resourcefulness in extending the life of harvests, managing scarce salt, and balancing diets helped them weather the most challenging winter months. Without these practices, starvation and malnutrition would have been even more common, highlighting the critical role of food preservation in medieval peasant life. For medieval peasants, domestic animals were invaluable assets that contributed significantly to winter survival. Beyond food sources, animals provided warmth, labor, and materials essential for everyday life, especially during the long, cold months. The most common animals kept by peasants included cattle, provided milk when available in winter, hides, and labor for plowing or hauling. Cattle were often stabled close to homes to share body heat. Sheep and goats, sources of wool, milk, and meat. Their fleece was vital for making warm clothing and blankets. Pigs, raised for meat. Pigs were usually slaughtered in late autumn to provide salted or smoked pork for winter consumption. Poultry, chickens and geese provided eggs, meat, and feathers for bedding. Working animals, horses and oxen were essential for transport and farming, although their needs required careful management during winter. To protect animals from the harsh weather, peasants constructed simple shelters such as barns, stables, or pens, often using straw bedding to insulate. Bringing animals close to human dwellings helped protect them from predators and cold, and shared body heat could also help warm living spaces. Feeding livestock in winter was challenging due to the scarcity of fresh forage. Stored hay, straw, and fodder crops such as turnips or mangelwurzel were critical winter feed. Peasants carefully rationed feed to keep animals alive and productive. Some communities cooperated to gather and share winter fodder. Animals provided meat. Slaughtering was often timed in late autumn or early winter, with preservation techniques such as salting or smoking applied immediately. Dairy, milk, and cheese were less abundant in winter, but remained valuable. Eggs, poultry egg-laying declined but continued sporadically. Byproducts, hides, wool, and feathers were harvested and used for clothing, bedding, and trade. Despite the cold, animals continued to assist peasants in essential tasks. Plowing and hauling were limited during deep winter, but ramped up in late winter to prepare for spring planting. Horses and oxen transported firewood, water, and other supplies. Animal manure was collected and stored as fertilizer. Animals held symbolic meaning in peasant culture and religion. Saints like St. Anthony the Abbot were patrons of animals and invoked for their health during winter. Animals featured in seasonal rituals and folk beliefs, with certain animals considered protectors or omens. Medieval peasants' relationship with their animals was one of interdependence. The survival of livestock was directly tied to human survival, making care and management a winter priority. The multifaceted role of animals, from food and clothing source, is to labor and companionship, was fundamental to enduring the harsh cold and scarcity of medieval winters. The medieval peasant's year was tightly bound to the rhythms of nature and the changing seasons. Each season brought distinct challenges and opportunities, requiring adaptations in work, diet, clothing, and social activities. Winter, with its biting cold and scarcity, was a test of endurance and ingenuity. Preparing for and adapting to winter was integral to survival. As autumn approached, peasants engaged in intensive work to secure food, fuel, and shelter for the coming cold months. Harvesting, gathering crops such as grains, root vegetables, and fruits. Preserving, drying herbs, salting meat, pickling vegetables. Stockpiling, collecting firewood, storing fodder for animals. Home maintenance, repairing roofs, sealing cracks, reinforcing doors and windows. These preparations were communal efforts, with neighbors often helping each other to ensure collective survival. During winter, daily routines slowed but did not stop. Peasants adapted by shifting labor. Outdoor farming tasks gave way to indoor crafts like weaving, tool repair, and making household goods. Diet changes. Reliance on stored and preserved foods increased. Clothing layers, wearing heavier, layered clothing both indoors and outdoors. Community activities, sharing resources, socializing around fires, and celebrating festivals to maintain morale. With the first signs of thaw, peasants prepared fields for planting, soil preparation, plowing and fertilizing fields, sowing seeds, timing planting to avoid late frosts, animal care, managing livestock births and weaning. Spring was a hopeful time but fraught with risks like unpredictable weather. Summer was the season of growth and toil, tending crops, weeding, watering, protecting from pests. Harvesting early crops, gathering hay, herbs, and some fruits, maintaining tools and buildings, repairs and improvements. Summer's warmth was a relief, but also brought challenges like droughts or storms. The cyclical nature of medieval peasant life, anchored in seasonal adaptations, was a survival strategy honed over centuries. Every season's demands shaped behavior, resource management, and social organization. Seasonal festivals and religious observance reinforced the cycle. Winter festivals, celebrations like Yule and Christmas offered communal warmth and spiritual hope. Spring rites symbolized rebirth and fertility. Harvest festivals marked the successful gathering of crops. These events provided psychological relief and strengthened community bonds. The medieval peasant's ability to survive the coldest nights and the entire yearly cycle depended on a profound understanding of nature's rhythms and a flexible, community-oriented approach. Their seasonal adaptations reflected resilience, resourcefulness, and deep respect for the land that sustained them. Water was essential for drinking, cooking, washing, and livestock care. However, in winter, accessing clean, unfrozen water became a critical challenge. Without safe water, survival was compromised, as dehydration and poor hygiene led to sickness. Peasants primarily relied on wells, often dug near homes. Wells provided a more reliable water source, less prone to freezing. Rivers and streams, used when accessible, though freezing and contamination were concerns. Rainwater collection, roof runoff collected in barrels or cisterns. Winter brought several water-related difficulties. Frozen water, rivers, streams, and shallow wells could freeze, making water collection difficult and dangerous. Contamination, stagnant water could become unsafe, and poor sanitation increased the risk of waterborne diseases. Transporting water, carrying water from distant sources in icy conditions was laborious and risky. Peasants developed adaptive methods to secure water, breaking ice, using tools to break river ice to reach water below. Heated wells, in rare cases, peat fires were kept near wells to prevent freezing. Snow and ice melting. Collected snow or ice was melted over fires for drinking and cooking. Winter's cold often discouraged bathing due to risk of chills and illness, but cleanliness was still necessary. Limited washing, quick washings with warmed water inside homes. Laundry, often delayed or reduced in winter. Animal hygiene, watering and cleaning livestock required additional effort. Water was used in making soups, potages, brewing ale, and preparing pickled or fermented foods vital for winter diets. Access to clean water was a daily struggle in the cold months, requiring effort, ingenuity, and community cooperation. Water management was as crucial as fire and shelter in enduring the harsh medieval winters. Winter drastically altered the rhythm of peasant life. With fields lying fallow under frost and snow, outdoor agricultural tasks were largely suspended. However, work did not cease. Rather, it shifted focus to essential indoor tasks maintenance, preparation for spring, and survival activities. The ability to adapt labor to seasonal constraints was critical for maintaining livelihoods and preparing for the next growing season. Though active farming slowed, peasants remained attentive to their fields. Equipment maintenance, sharpening blades, repairing tools, and preparing farming implements ensured readiness for spring. Seed storage and sorting. Seeds were cleaned, sorted, and stored carefully to preserve viability. Fertilizer management. Manure accumulated during winter was prepared for application in early spring, including composting or spreading in sheltered piles. Winter's cold encouraged a shift to indoor productive labor. Textile production, spinning wool, weaving cloth, knitting, and repairing garments were vital to replenish winter clothing and bedding. Food processing, grinding grain with hand querns, baking bread in communal ovens, preserving meat and fish through salting and smoking. Tool and household item repair, fixing pottery, making wooden utensils, and mending household goods. Crafting and trade, some peasants engaged in small-scale crafts such as basket weaving, candle making, or ironwork, which could supplement income. Winter demanded special attention to livestock. Feeding, regular distribution of stored fodder to animals kept them alive and productive. Sheltering, ensuring animals were protected from cold, drafts, and predators. Monitoring health, identifying signs of illness and applying traditional remedies. Despite snow and ice, some foraging persisted. Firewood collection, gathering fallen branches or splitting logs. Winter foraging, harvesting hardy wild plants, bark, or nuts stored during autumn. Hunting and trapping, opportunistic hunting of small game or trapping was undertaken, though often limited by weather. Winter work often had a communal aspect. Shared tasks. Neighbors collaborated on heavy chores like splitting wood or communal baking. Mutual aid, assistance in caring for animals or food preparation, reinforced community bonds. Festive preparation, crafting decorations, cooking for festivals, and organizing religious observance is required coordinated effort. Winter also offered a relative respite from backbreaking field labor. Rest periods, peasants utilized slower days to rest and conserve energy. Reflection and planning. Time was spent planning crop rotations, seed selection, and strategies for the coming year. Religious observance. The long nights invited contemplation, prayer, and participation in church activities. The winter months, though harsh and limiting, were far from idle. Through adaptive labor focused on maintenance, preparation, and community, peasants ensured their survival and set the stage for future productivity. Understanding these seasonal labor patterns highlights the resilience and ingenuity embedded in medieval peasant life. Medieval peasants faced significant dietary challenges during winter. The cold months meant fresh produce was scarce, and limited variety in the diet increased the risk of nutritional deficiencies. Nevertheless, peasants employed preservation methods and clever use of available resources to sustain themselves through the harsh season. Peasant diets were predominantly plant-based, supplemented by occasional animal products, with significant variation depending on region and resources. Grains, barley, rye, oats, and wheat were staples. Grain was consumed as bread, porridge, or pottage. Root vegetables, carrots, turnips, parsnips, onions, and garlic were stored in cellars or pits to last through winter. Legumes, dried peas, and beans were important protein sources. Preserved meat and fish, salted, smoked, or dried meats and fish supplemented diets when fresh options were unavailable. Dairy products, cheese and butter, especially from goats and sheep, provided fats and proteins. Fats and oils, Animal fats were used for cooking and energy, though vegetable oils were rare. Winter survival depended heavily on food preservation, employing several methods. Drying, meats, fish, herbs, and fruits were dried to prevent spoilage. Salting and smoking, salted meats and fish were smoked to add flavor and extend shelf life. Pickling, vegetables were preserved in vinegar or brine. Storage, root cellars and cool, dark place, is helped keep perishables longer. Peasants typically consumed 1 or 2 main meals daily, often pottage, a thick stew made from grains, vegetables, and occasionally meat or fish. Bread, a coarse, dense rye or barley bread accompanied meals. Ale and small beer, fermented beverage, is provided hydration and calories. Meals were simple but calorically sufficient, designed to sustain physical labor and generate body heat. Winter diets lacked variety, risking deficiencies. Vitamin C, limited fresh fruits and vegetables led to scurvy risks, though some wild greens and preserved herbs helped mitigate this. Protein, reliance on grains and legumes sometimes caused protein shortages. Calories, high energy demands required sufficient caloric intake, which was not always achievable. Food was more than sustenance. Sharing, communal meals and resource sharing fostered social bonds. Festive foods, special foods during Christmas and other festivals boosted morale. Rituals, food offerings were part of religious and seasonal ceremonies. Medieval peasants' winter diets reflected adaptation to scarcity and seasonal constraints. Preservation skills, dietary knowledge, and community cooperation were vital to maintaining health and energy through the cold months. Despite challenges, their dietary strategies underscore resilience in the face of nature's hardships. For medieval peasants, the home was the frontline defense against the coldest nights. Given the primitive construction techniques and materials available, building and maintaining a warm, dry shelter was crucial to winter's survival. Without modern insulation or heating technology, peasants relied on resourcefulness and tradition to maximize warmth. Peasant homes varied regionally but shared many common features. Materials, timber frames filled with wattle and daub woven sticks plastered with mud and straw, stone foundations, and thatched. Turf roofs, size and layout, typically small, often 1 or 2 rooms with a central hearth, serving as both cooking and heating source. Floors, packed earth floors were common, sometimes covered with rushes or straw for insulation. Windows and doors, small or absent windows minimized heat loss. Wooden shutters or animal hide covered openings. To combat drafts and moisture, sealing cracks, mud, straw, and cloth stuffed into gaps. Thick walls, wattle and daub or stone walls provided some thermal mass. Roofing, thatch, and turf roofs offered insulation, though maintenance was needed to prevent leaks. External measures, fences and hedges sometimes acted as windbreaks. The hearth was the heart of the home, central hearth, open fire pits on. The floor or a stone hearth provided heat and a place to cook. Chimneys, rare in early medieval homes. Smoke often escaped through roof gaps or a hole. Firewood and fuel. Wood was primary. Peat and dried animal dung were alternatives in some regions. Fire safety. Fires had to be carefully tended to prevent accidents. Peasants employed various strategies to maximize heat retention. Clustering, sleeping and sitting close to the hearth or sharing body heat. Curtains and screens, cloth or wooden partitions kept heat localized. Bedding, straw mattresses, furs, and heavy blankets retained warmth during sleep. Night fires were often kept burning overnight to maintain warmth. Despite efforts, medieval homes were cold and smoky. Smoke exposure, poor ventilation caused respiratory issues, but was a trade-off for warmth. Dampness, moisture from breath, cooking, and weather often caused mold and discomfort. Space constraints, Small, crowded homes limited heat circulation and privacy. In some villages, peasants shared larger communal buildings during winter for better warmth and security. Temporary shelters or outbuildings protected animals and stored fuel. Peasant housing reflected a balance between available resources, environmental demands, and social needs. The ingenuity in construction and heating practice is allowed medieval peasants to endure bitter winters despite primitive conditions. Throughout this exploration, it has become clear that medieval peasants survived the coldest nights not by chance, but through a combination of practical knowledge, community cooperation, and adaptation to their environment. From building insulated homes and layering clothing to managing food supplies, fuel, and water, their survival was a complex, multi-faceted endeavor. Peasants lived in intimate connection with the land and the seasons. Their daily lives were shaped by natural cycles, with winter posing the greatest challenges. The survival strategies were not only physical, but also social and spiritual rituals, festivals, and communal support offered psychological warmth alongside the physical. Despite limited technology, peasants innovated within their means. Their survival methods reveal a deep understanding of natural materials, weather patterns, and human needs. These adaptations, passed down through generations, helped communities persist through some of Europe's harshest winters. The medieval peasant experience teaches resilience, resourcefulness, and the power of community qualities still vital in modern times. Their story highlights how human beings can endure extreme hardship by working with nature rather than against it. Medieval peasants were the backbone of European society, often overlooked in history. Yet their daily struggle against the cold and their ingenious survival tactics laid the groundwork for future generations. Understanding their endurance enriches our appreciation of human tenacity and adaptability.